Greetings and welcome back to another discussion. Today I'm very pleased to bring you Mr. Kai Chang. He is a person who's kind of known in the public. He has a public profile, unlike a lot of us. Many of you might know him from Frame Game Radio. He's a friend of his, and he talks to him on podcasts. And today we're going to be talking about China and China in the West, which is increasingly or arguably one of the most important topics you could cover and discuss because of the very different values, the trajectories of things, et cetera, et cetera. But before we launch into the questions, Kai, maybe if you give the audience a bit of a bio, where you're from,
Sure.
how you
Absolutely.
evolved, et cetera.
I think, so the first thing I think that's worth mentioning is that I am speaking from an outsider standpoint, born in Taiwan, and then lived in Japan from age 2 to age 6, and then immigrated to the United States around age 6, age 7. So I've been an outsider, and as is my family. My family, both my parents were also, they fled China during the Cultural Revolution. So even in Taiwan, they're not considered native Taiwanese. They were part of a huge spike of Kuomintang that fled China during the cataclysmic shift from to communism. And so my observations are partially from that sort of informed from the Taiwanese perspective. And so there are kind of more hardcore China loyalists that may view some of my perceptions of China as being excessively negative. I try to be honest about my own biases. I think a lot of the information I do get fed is from that lens, but I'll acknowledge my own limitations and my own natural organic biases.
Wouldn't you concede that as someone who's sort of between the worlds, that gives you a broader perspective than someone who
I'd like to think that.
Yeah.
I'd like to think that, but we always want to believe that we're far more objective than we truly are. So I think that's a conceit that is it's one of the biggest, I think, cognitive traps a lot of people of above average intelligence suffers from, is this view that, well, since I'm so clever and because of my unique circumstances, I have exclusive understanding of the objective truth. Unlike all these other morons that are in their little bubble, I know I can see things clearly. And that self-flattery is way more oftentimes undeserved. So I want to keep myself humble by saying I'm willing to be corrected based on new information, but having some outsider perspective, I think I can watch things and have a different perspective, hopefully a more accurate one. I think in a Frame Games stream, I talked about this idea of red pilling, that I think a lot of people have, it's a term that's tossed around a lot, but I think a lot of times people make the mistaken notion that red pilling is a one-time experience. Like, before I was working with bad information, but now because of this one experience, I now have the accurate understanding of the world, and it's like, no. My revised understanding of it is that we were all at birth given a intentionally flawed map of the world designed to manipulate most people into making choices to the map maker's advantage. And each red pilling experience is you trading in your intentionally bad map for a slightly less shitty map.
And you never stop learning.
Correct.
That's
and this notion that I'm done doing I've now had this perfect map that perfectly describes the world, that conceit, different people at different levels of red pilling congratulate themselves prematurely for that. And I never want to get to that point, because I'm of the view that there's always going to be heresies that I currently blanch from that I might end up accepting 5-10 years down the line. And that's kind of a very meta view of it, but that's kind of how I see it. There's a constant set of upgrading of maps.
It's pretty much how I operate. I'm less of a kind of macro corporate guy. I just look at it, everything's a learning experience. So if I didn't know something a couple of years ago and I know it now, I try to integrate it into the membrane of my life. And
Exactly.
I realize that you never stop learning, and even if you're not actively seeking out knowledge, you still come by things and facts that can at times bowl you over. Although eventually, the more red pills you consume, I would argue that the more resistant you are to being kind of floored by it all.
Correct.
But I think this is something that it's it's really easy to get caught up in a certain mentality that's born of an ideology that is at least partially based in fact and information, and it's inevitable that some views might change. And I think the risk there, and I think that's why it's a really good attitude you have, is that if you create a brand name under a particular ideology that is based at least partially in fact, but new information arises, then you're left the sort of that preacher who no longer really believes what he believes, but it's basically his job, right? The guy who's preaching to the flock, but he doesn't believe the Bible anymore, or what have you, that kind of thing. So.
But both exactly. Either the cynical view is that now he sees that it's a source of income he doesn't want to jeopardize, and also from a more benevolent standpoint, he sees that this, now from his perspective, false belief system does give order and hope to a lot of people that would shatter their lives for no good reason. So both reasons, it creates a lot of conflict, and this is why I've developed a lot more sympathy for leaders that I had my libertarian phase where I kind of cynically viewed all leaders as self-serving jerks who are just there to hoover up as much government resources for themselves as possible. Now it's like, even if you're an absolutely benevolent leader trying to do the best, just make the best decision for the most number of people, if you're in charge of a large nation, every decision you make will literally be bad for millions of people. Right? If you raise taxes, if you lower taxes, more benefits this direction, less this. Every single decision you make will negatively impact literally millions of people. It might be for the better good, but it's like you will hurt people. Even if you have absolutely a benevolent agenda, it will result in tons of people being on the wrong side of whatever tax bracket you enact, whatever cutoff that has to be done by legislative fiat. It's just a hard necessity of rule. So that's
but the real challenge there is, if you want to be a humble and intellectually honest person and a leader at the same time, there's a bit or even a large conflict there, because people, the flock as it were, doesn't take well to shifts in alignment and perspective, because they want you to stay the course, of course, no matter what.
You're a flip-flopper. That's one of the worst things to say, but even though any intellectually honest person would probably experience quite a few shifts in their own belief systems and understanding the world over the course of their adult life. You're not allowed that. So you either have to be genuinely dogmatic or play one, basically add a level of dishonesty or image management over the course of your life just by sheer force and necessity. It's a hard decision. I mean, this is exactly why I have no interest in political office, is because it just seems like such a lousy deal. You're living a lie constantly, and sometimes you have to do deals with shady people who you know them and know their depth of their moral turpitude, but nonetheless they are the only ones who can get you what you need. So you have to grit your teeth and do business with them. I mean, this is just a hard reality.
And I recognize this from my own YouTube life, small content producer that I am. I've been around for a while, and as I've shifted my views and just decided to focus on more varied and different content rather than the stuff that I originally started with, a lot of people were critical. They call me all kinds of not so nice things, label me as something, but I have to say, from my own perspective, I don't think I even have that capacity. Maybe it's just baked into my neurology to just dogmatically pursue something, even though I don't think it's the most interesting thing, or there's more than meets the eye than just that. I really had, at some point in time, I had to branch out into other avenues, and the consequence was there was defection, if you want to call it that, and people that were, even to this day, very critical of me, and I think mischaracterize me and my views. But it sounds cheesy, but I kind of had to be true to myself in that regard.
Yeah. And that's because other people with a more marketing standpoint might have taken the view that, no, I'm going to get consistent, because if I grow my audience to this new level, I can influence you more, so I'm willing to take a short-term hit internally in terms of my own feeling of internal consistency to build a consistent brand that people can reliably view me in a particular way. And you made the internally consistent decision, but that cost you in terms of external credibility.
Yeah, and it's definitely cost me in growth, because I know on occasion if I make videos that are more, I mean, I guess you could say my purview historically has been sort of sex realism. If I make videos about that, the view count is double, triple, quadruple what it would be if I talk about more esoteric things, more scientific things. But again, there's more that, to me, there's more than just that to talk about, and it's something that I understand why people do that, but I'm not going to be the person to do it. And I'm not going to be a politician or a leader in that regard. I'm trying to explore the world and understand it, and that's what makes me content. So,
yeah, absolutely. So, on that topic, I think, and it is still interesting seeing how much Western, especially I would imagine Americans, incorrectly project their own freedoms and latitude onto the rest of the world. The fact that in America people are wringing their hands talking about how we're living under a dictatorship, and it's like, no, right? It's like the 90% of the world is living in some form of dictatorship, 80% maybe. This is one of the least authoritarian places, and yet nonetheless, the histrionic caterwauling makes you think that we're like 2 steps away from everyone being lined up and gassed in camps.
Well, Kai, apropos, I mean, and forgive I don't speak Chinese, but Xi Jinping, Xi
Jinping,
Russian, sorry, my apologies.
No worries.
I'm just a Lao Wai. So, I mean, that's a great example of something that is unthinkable in the United States. He just recently abolished term limitations, right?
Right. Yep.
And
everybody goes, okay, fine. Yep.
I mean, one, because it's a good way to launch it. You're talking about this topic. What was the Chinese reaction, and how? I mean, obviously outside of China, whether it's in Europe or the United States, and people are they're pulling their hair out. But people just kind of nodded their heads. Here's
a couple of layers of this. The first layer is that immediately after this, as you may or may not know, so let's assume everyone is more unfamiliar with China. China, the entirety of it is like, their internet is the kind of internet you get at work. It's quarantined and curated, just like a work internet where you can't look at porn, you can't look at forbidden sites, and you can't browse for guns or whatever. That is all of China's internet. The only way to get out of it is to use a bunch of proxies, a couple of workarounds, and even then, the feeling is that the Chinese authorities take a very dim view and pay extra attention to those who are using proxies. So the Chinese internet is very different. Things that you take for granted, like Facebook and Wikipedia, are banned in China. So the China has their own form of Facebook called Weibo, Weibo.com, and within Weibo, that's the social media of China, where the Chinese are allowed to talk to each other under the watchful eye of government censors. And the moment this term limitation was abolished, a whole bunch of keywords were automatically flagged as it shows up, and you make a post, it just automatically vanishes. It doesn't even post. It just automatically doesn't exist. And if you try to get around it, then it becomes sort of like, okay, you're subversive. So there's a couple of puns. My Chinese isn't good enough, but I remember people were trying to do, because you couldn't directly talk about no term limitations. There was Chinese is a tonal language, and so there's a couple of puns around the word, like eternal king or whatever, that became sort of trending. Where it was said with a wink and a nod, and everyone understood it. But once it became entered into popular lexicon, those terms got added to the banned lexicon. It became a constant moving game of whack-a-mole. And if you had plausible deniability, no, I was just talking about a forever king. I wasn't talking about our current president. I was just talking about hypothetical. And until it becomes commonly known, then you have to kind of tap dance around it. There's this constant weird moving target, because obviously slang there's a whole culture in China of slang adapting and shifting around the censors. There's a term of derision more used outside of China than within, called the 50-cent army, 五毛. Effectively, it's the lowest level of the government censors that are paid around 50 cents per pro-government post they write. They go into discussion forums where the discussion can potentially lead toward an anti-government sentiment, and they're there to kind of steer the conversation as if they're an organic part of the conversation. Go, hey, well, that guy's not that bad. And And if they get identified, they're referred to, oh yeah, you're just another 50-cent shill. Fuck off. So that's a known quantity. That's known kind of slangs within the Chinese culture, and that 50-cent army thing also becomes a term of derision as well. If one is suspected as such, then it's like, well, clearly we know why you're talking about this. We know why you're taking the side of that. But again, if everything is done with plausible deniability in mind, because the sanctions for being explicitly anti-government is severe. You can be rounded up, hauled off to jail for speaking ill of a government official. So it's all done with an eye toward, if all of my social media posts were exposed, can I talk my way out of it? So there will be no actual, this guy needs to step down, he's a terrible president. No one will ever say anything to that level. It's all subtle innuendo and jokes and sort of tap dancing.
A question, how much, from the outside perspective, one gets the impression that the typical Chinese person, or even a majority of them, are not very politically active. That is to say, they're very content to bask in their sort of nouveau riche wealth and just sort of enjoy the luxuries of life and not get too involved in politics. Of course, there are dissidents, and you and I are both children of the 80s, so we all remember Tiananmen Square, and I still remember the covers of magazines and the showdown. Oh, yeah. But is that an accurate outsider perspective to say that given the new accumulation of wealth and people, the tourism that you see as a consequence and the exploitation of Western universities and all of that, that most Chinese people just don't care about these political developments?
I think the ones that I see, there is less curiosity about it. And I think it primarily because it's very, very expensive to care about it. It's not something you can just casually browse through and think there's no consequences. Your activities online are monitored, and so if you wish to rise within the ranks of Chinese society, if you wish to be one of the nouveau riche, remember, as you see this very wealthy crust of newly wealthy Chinese, but most of China by population is still making about $1,000 a month, U.S. equivalent, in terms of earning power. There's a lot of anxiety and insecurity amongst those who haven't reached the upper crust, that if you do these sorts of things, you are cut off from any chance of going from the 50th percentile in China to the 60th percentile. And 50% of China is very, very miserable. You have no earning power. You're assembling iPhones in some Foxconn facility. You might be a junior manager. It's a miserable existence. And that combined with the fact that China has this, the other hard pressure that affects a lot of decisions within China is that within Chinese culture there is a strong preference for boys, and that in combination with China's one-child per family policy means that for the last about 40 years, there's about 113 to 115 boys born for every 100 girls. By DNA, it should be 50-50, but sex selection abortions, while technically illegal, is done all the time. And the result is that for live births, it's about 113 to 115. Zooming that out a little bit, with a population of China in the billion, that works out to about, China has between the ages of 18 and 40, 35 million surplus males just within that age range.
I've actually followed that, and that creates a huge tension in the sexual dynamics of the sexual marketplace.
And exactly, speaking of sexual marketplaces, this is one that is so you're, as a male, if you're simply at the mean or even at the 60th percentile, you have no hope of finding a long-term partner. Your only sexual releases will be brothels.
Well, everyone on my channel knows that. You must know that song, "No Car, No House," right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Everyone in the manosphere knows that song.
Yes.
Yeah.
And that is just simply the baseline. Exacerbating beyond that is that you have people at the very upper end that can have extra mistresses, pulling more eligible women off of the marketplace. A guy who's at the 60th percentile, they'd just be grateful to have a wife. Now he's competing with the son of a billionaire who's got a girlfriend in Shanghai, a girlfriend in Beijing, and another girl he's seeing and each of them have their own apartments, their own cars and whatnot in every single major city. Because if you're an attractive girl and you can't lock down a husband, the alternative is to have your life semi-subsidized by a wealthy guy. And it becomes a sort of soft prostitution, which they get something they want and he gets what he wants, versus you can devote your entire resources to being married to a guy that can barely keep up the mortgage on a single crummy apartment in Shanghai. It's because of all this, the financial incentives means that if you're very, very wealthy, you're already part of the system, and there's no incentive to buck the system that has been so generous to you. If you are aspiring into that inner circle, you want to do nothing to upset those who can deny you access to the inner circle. The chances are you're not going to make it anyway, but you don't want to jeopardize what few opportunities you get to elevate your own station. So for all those reasons, I mean, being a dissident is a luxury, I think. It takes either tremendous independence of mind, which the Chinese are not known for, or it takes I'm wealthy enough that I can kind of stick my middle finger at those who I'm living off of to kind of buck the system. And it's a super, super small subset. I mean, think about in the U.S. If you are employed at a big company, there are a lot of forbidden opinions you really can't express. People that own their own businesses, you look on Twitter and whatnot, there are people that can be a bit more open in expressing their dissident opinions, but they still suffer tremendously for it. I'm thinking about, like, specifically Scott Adams, who was previous to Trump's run for office, primarily known as the Dilbert guy, and he had actually a pretty good and very lucrative career, doing corporate appearances, book signings, and whatnot. The moment he started speaking frankly about Trump, not even praising him necessarily, just simply speaking about his persuasion skills, and that was Scott Adams' primary focus of it, just simply not trashing him the way other people were. He talked about how he basically, all of his speaking gigs dried up. It's his immediate source of income. Fortunately, he's independently wealthy. He was able to effectively say, you know what, I'm done with about $1 million a year of income. And nonetheless, I mean, he ended up building a second career for himself because he made some very bold and aggressive predictions about Trump's victory, which at the time seemed impossible. And then with all that date-stamped predictions came true, people started clamoring for his opinions and his hot takes on other things. And so there was no guarantee he would get to this place, but he intentionally walked away from a sure thing. All you had to do was keep your mouth shut, and you can just keep showing up to gigs and cash $1 million+ checks for the rest of your life. Not a bad gig. But he was independently wealthy enough that he was willing to say no to this 7-digit stream of income for the uncertain possibility of being seen as a pundit, which is something he's never done before. And he obviously still has his Dilbert cartoons, but the big money for these things is these corporate appearances, which he completely torpedoed as a result of speaking on it. It's a very weird person to do that. He had to be either very, very wealthy and independent. And even then, it was a hard decision financially for him.
Well, from a mainstream perspective, he's a social pariah. I mean, because he's
yes.
I remember I paid close attention to the interview that he did with Sam Harris, and Sam Harris is kind of like a 90s style liberal base guy, I'd say, like left of center. And he was just repeatedly incredulous at any point Adams might make, and also a completely different worldview. Sam Harris is very concerned with facts and data as a rule, and he doesn't have that, I guess, point of admiration that Adams has just for the art of persuasion, which oftentimes, or more often than not, has very little to do with facts and information, and more how you manipulate bits of information and communicate to the crowd. And he just couldn't. There was this complete disconnect. They were like sort of two aliens who were talking past each other in a sense.
Yep. So that's kind of it's a tough thing. And the Chinese, if we're going with racial stereotypes, I think the Chinese are far less philosophically curious about exploring ideas and more about maximizing one's own earning power. And so doing something that's controversial, that doesn't have a positive EV, expected value of getting some sort of financial returns, is viewed as just a generally foolish thing. Either it would be a pretty high outlier to be that curious enough to jeopardize Because if you're that curious, you'll definitely jeopardize your earning power. There might be some pundit kind of a thing you can do, but it's such low EV. It's like emptying out your savings account and buying lottery tickets with it. Sure, one of them might hit, and all of a sudden it makes you like a 8-digit millionaire. But the almost certain thing statistically is it's going to lower your financial standing, and that's how intellectual curiosity about forbidden ideas is viewed culturally within China. You're going to have a couple of weirdos, but on balance, it's considered a foolish and negative EV decision.
I have to wonder how much that has to do with the Cultural Revolution, because I'm more familiar with the Korean Peninsula, and it's not obviously not identical, but in the wake of the Korean War in South Korea, there was a mad rush to, I guess, get the country off the ground, to build the country, and the Koreans wanted to prove themselves to the world and to themselves that they could basically be an economic powerhouse. And it's a small place, but in its own right, it is these days. And I think when you're primarily focused on growth and building, and this is reflected in the architecture, I'd imagine mainland China is similar. You have these things in South Korea, these big, ugly apartment buildings in rows, just to house the population. You put aside aesthetic and you could say intellectual considerations for pragmatic and more, I guess, financial considerations, and you just kind of push forward with that. Would you say that's a lot of that is due to the Cultural Revolution and China wanting to sort of prove themselves to themselves and to the world?
There's definitely that anxiety that the Chinese are very insecure about their place in the world. That we're the oldest civilization, a country that's largely been unconquered by outside forces, and yet lagged the West. Even though we were financially further ahead, our insularness kept us from unlocking all of our potential. So yes, there's a sense of like, we got to get the Chinese culture is very image oriented, and so glittering streets and ostentatious displays of wealth are more important than brilliant scientists and philosophers who can articulate some new. The drive toward that is certainly far less. The motivation toward that is certainly far less than I want to show off that all of my major cities are filled with like giant skyscrapers, expensive cars, all the nicest stuff. That we've caught up. We've fully arrived, and a lot of the energy that is expended in China is toward that end.
Yeah, and obviously political considerations, as you pointed out, are a luxury given all that. You're either at the bottom rung, you're just trying to survive, or if you're the top of the ladder, given how much corruption and graft there is in the upper echelons of Chinese society, you probably just bribe people to get things done anyway.
Yep. So that's the thing, is that there is, and a lot of this new wealth is from bribery. There's a lot of the wealth that is now leaving China is it's stolen money. It's government officials who've abused their positions in order to fleece to line their own pockets, and they're already anticipating that they may be caught one day, and therefore want to move as much of their assets outside China's ability for the government of China to seize any sort of proceeds from illicit goods. And so that's why they're buying these like $1 million, $2 million condos in Vancouver and San Francisco and putting it in the names of their children or in trusts and whatnot, so that even if they get caught and disgorged of all of their ill-gotten gains, they'll still have something. And why they don't care about getting ripped off and having like a 10, 15, 20% haircut is because it's all stolen money anyway. Do you care about getting 80% of the stolen millions or 85%? It doesn't matter. It's all stolen anyway. And yeah, so that's the thing, is that and that creates a lot of. China is still, as a people, we're a low trust culture, and so we reflexively mistrust each other, and for good reason. I think we touched on this in a conversation privately, that Japan, if you look at the three large cultures of Asia, Japan, Korea, and China, Japan is high trust. It's considered unseemly to be dishonest, even if there's a zero chance of you getting caught.
Extremely polite, at least superficially. Yes. So, yeah.
Yes. And And I mean, to the point of, and this still blows my mind that there's been several cases of what there's natural disasters in Japan where there was floods, earthquakes, and whatnot, and police stations would be filled with people just turning in money. Like, well, I found all this wad of bills just floated by the river, and it's not mine. So I'd feel weird hanging out to it. There's no name to it. I have no idea who it goes to, so it's probably just going to get kept. But just in case someone lost that amount of money within this and this area, I want there to be. That's the Japanese ethos, right? We laugh at this, like, oh, those silly Japanese, but that's the general Japanese culture, and there are a lot of societal benefits of living in a culture that is that pathologically honest. That Japanese police officers are oftentimes like frustrated; they have nothing to do. They have to like start chasing down super low level crimes because there isn't a shoplifting culture. There isn't people. The amount of casual law breaking in Japan is almost non-existent. It's either purposeful law breaking, like Yakuza level, like organized crime stuff, but the average Japanese person just feels weird even like talking loudly on their cell phone or cutting in line. It's just considered you have to scrape the bottom 1% of Japanese society to find people willing to do even such petty crimes. Whereas the Chinese mentality is whatever you can get away with. Now, if you get caught doing something bad, it's very, very shameful. But it's about not getting caught. It's not about and that's the shame. Not that the activity is shameful, but that you getting caught is the shameful part. And that's so. While both have a shame culture, I think it's expressed in different ways. One is simply about appearances, and the other one is sort of more of an internally guided, like it's just a bad thing to do, whether you get caught or not.
Yeah, it's an ethos. I have had experience with FOBs, so-called fresh off the boat
Yes,
Chinese in the West, and they were uniformly loud, obnoxious, uncouth.
Yep.
Yeah, talk about cutting in front of queues. It
Yep.
was. I'm not going to lie. I didn't have a good experience with them.
No, and it's very embarrassing as a Chinese person to see that is the statistically average behavior of people from China, and it's just taken for granted.
How much is this really attributable to the profound political and economic changes that took place in the 20th century? I mean, I would imagine that had things turned out differently, there had been no cultural revolution or something else had happened, then maybe things wouldn't be quite this bad or this way at least.
There's definitely some cultural, it's not entirely genetic, I will agree with that. I mean, take for example, like Singapore. Singapore is a place that is ethnically about the same composition as China proper. It's Han Chinese, but Singaporean Chinese are very well behaved by way of comparison. If you've ever met people from Singapore or visited there, the comportment and the sort of internal, there's two components for sure. And when you interact, because China is so physically large, you're seeing, sadly, most of Chinese are under mainland Chinese culture, not Singaporean culture. So you're seeing,
and Singapore. I've studied it's fascinating what Lee Kuan Yew did because he integrated Western jurisprudence values to some degree, and took into account the history and the ethnicities and cultures to create something that really is pretty unique in the world and in its own right very successful.
Yep. And I think this is the part that a lot of a lot of libertarians get wrong, and as well as a lot of like civic nationalists get wrong. There is this, if this system works for these people, it will work anywhere. That globalization that refuses to acknowledge cultural idiosyncrasies.
Yeah, I remember
it's really naive.
And I remember seeing when Lee Kuan Yew was still alive, because I'm a bit of an admirer of him, and I kind of followed his life course, and he'd get in these interviews the people at Harvard or whatever, wherever, these pundits, and everyone was just incredulous. They couldn't grasp. They said, no, it needs to be this way. And Lee Kuan Yew was a very smart, wise guy. He knew that, what worked in the United Kingdom and the United States wouldn't necessarily work in Singapore because there's obviously going to be some genetic component, but also just different histories, different developments there. You can't create a mirror image of something. And we see what happens when the quote-unquote attempt at liberal democracy is is tried in places like the Middle East. It doesn't work for all kinds of
No,
reasons.
no. And I think that naivete is largely it's a product of that false projection, which I think is something that Western whites are particularly prone to. There doesn't seem to be a naivete within China. Like, think about what's happening right now with the number of colonies that are being set up in Africa from Chinese major corporations. The difference between the Chinese have this explicit view that, yes, they are different from us, the native Africans are different from us, and we're going to take that into account. We're not going to assume, and this is, I think, the big difference is that Western culture, for good or for ill, is heavily influenced by the Christian ethos. Whether you are, as a white person, individually Christian or not is irrelevant. It's that your belief systems, your sense of justice, your culture, all were influenced by a top-down Christian influence sense of
universality.
Right, the universality. God, we are all God's creations. God watches over all of us. We will be judged for our sins, but we can find redemption through. All these things are permeates throughout Western culture, and you are the end result of that, whether or not you individually accept the Christian faith. Whereas the Chinese have a very different view, and so that Christian faith, I think, it makes you vulnerable to the sort of white guilt that anytime in history some white person did something negative to somebody else, oh, well, I'm guilty for this. It's that concept of original sin is also subsumed into the subconsciousness of whites in a way that's not true for anyone else in the world. There is no Arabic person, there's no Chinese person, there is no black person that says, oh, my ancestors did some really shitty thing to some other people, and therefore I must take upon, it's my personal duty to atone for the sins of my ancestors. No. Nobody else does this.
This is where this term, and forgive my pronunciation, Baizuo.
Yes. Baizuo is this sort of derision that the Chinese have for identifying this particular kind of, within the American, Western right-wing sphere, the term is cuck, and it's one that it's a more cutting version of that. Effectively, it's you're taking on obligations that really have nothing to do with you in an effort to look righteous to others who have the similarly goofy value system. So it's a insult not just to the individual, but also the fact that there's such an ecosystem exists where you can actually gain status by signaling against your own kind. So it's a double insult. It's like you belong to a shitty community and you're a shitty member of the shitty community.
Yeah, I think a lot of this is very particular to the United States. When the United States became, I guess, sort of the default ruler of the world post-World War II, there's a kind of American values in the United States tend to be sort of universal. There's this projection that everyone's an American and everyone... Now, I am familiar with the British Empire. When the British Empire was in power, they didn't quite have that attitude because they themselves were very aware of class differences in their own societies. And so they took note of, say, in India, of the different groups of people, the caste system. Americans, when they historically, they just... And as a consequence, you see all these mistakes made, be it the Korean War, Vietnam, the mistakes made in the Middle East, this idea that you can just sort of implant, transport democracy, that everyone thinks the way you do. It's a very naive American, in particular, way, not just Western, but very American way of thinking
very
about
American,
things.
I would agree. And that's sort of like, here's our Constitution, Control V, Control C, now you've got a Constitution too. And we see the biggest failure of that obviously be Liberia. For those of your listeners who are not familiar, Liberia is a colony in Africa of freed slaves who decided, well, we're going to do exactly that. We're going to have a version of America in Africa, and we're going to use the U.S. Constitution as sort of a template as a basis for our new society. We're going to have elections. We're going to do all the stuff that all those white folks do, except we'll do it here. And what Liberia quickly devolved into were that the freed slaves with the highest level of agency just simply establish themselves as the new warlords of a benighted African tribe like every other African tribe.
Yeah, there was an interesting documentary back when Vice was still good on the cannibal warlords of Liberia.
Oh dear Lord. Dissident cannibalism. Okay, I didn't know about that. Oh my God.
Oh well, there's a great Kai, you should check it out. I think it took the filming. This was back when I think Vice was pretty decent. I think 2012, but in the 90s there was a civil war, and there's this guy named, it's not even a joke. His name was quite literally General Butt Naked. And
it was in Liberia. Oh shit!
Yeah,
right.
The reason why he was called that because he and his troop and his followers would run around naked because they thought they had magic powers to protect them from bullets and stuff.
Yes.
And they were well known for eating the entrails and heart and the organs of slain enemies. And it's an interesting documentary, to say the least. But yeah, these things don't happen overnight. You can't just transplant. And this is why I always just fall back to Lee Kuan Yew's general philosophy, not specifically as applied to Singapore, but the idea that if you want to build a society, you have to take in all the variables of that particular region, of the culture, of the people. You can't just say, there's no one. And I think this is an affront to a lot of people in the West. But the fact of the matter is, given their populations are distinct to the degree of which is unknown exactly, but genetically, culturally, obviously, historically, there's no one shoe-size-fits-all formula oftentimes. Correct. And as for myself, I'm perfectly willing to say, look, Singapore soft dictatorship, fine. If that's what works for them, great. Why? For me, I don't get up in arms about this kind of thing. But there's a kind of puritanical sort of virtue signaling thing on the part of especially Americans that that type of system would exist at all, and it needs to be eradicated and replaced. It irks me in a way because it's a very small-minded view of things.
It is. It's a universalism, and I kind of weirdly imperialistic in this regard. Like we need to impose our understanding and sense of justice and righteousness on the rest of the world. They would never call themselves as such, but that is the sort of imperialistic view of some cultures, and some cultures are so toxic that your best thing you can do is quarantine yourself from it. Right? I mean, this is the other thing that is hard for the Western mind to accept. But yes, some cultures are so death spirally toxic that there isn't going to be, they're fleeing oppression. It's like, no, but they're just going to bring those practices here. And I'm speaking specifically about Islamic cultures where there's enough toxic elements toward it that there's no real way to reconcile a culture of honor killings and death for apostasy into a Western land. I mean, I don't know if you've probably seen that video in England of an imam who asked a large audience of Muslim men, all men, no women, seated amongst them, and said, how many of you would consider yourself ordinary, normal Muslims, not extreme, just regular, normal Muslims? And everyone raised their hand. Oh, inshallah, Allah Akbar, whatever. And then he said, how many of you, you're regular Muslim, you're not extremist. How many of you believe that if the Quran says the correct punishment for homosexuality is death, that is what you would endorse? And and everyone raised their hand. It's like unanimous, death penalty for apostasy, leaving the religion, death penalty for homosexuality. These are English-speaking, quote-unquote, moderate Muslims that are willing to be on camera raising their hands in agreement with. How does that dovetail in with a secular Western democracy?
Well, it doesn't, and that's why why you have these enclaves that develop.
And that's that sort of incompatibility, I think, and because we're unwilling to be honest with ourselves, that some elements, if you and I have a disagreement, a stark political disagreement, I'm pretty confident you're not going to kill me over it, and vice versa. We can, at the very worst, be like, just agree to disagree. Or we can figure out, well, why do you believe this way? There's nothing that you can say that makes it, you know what, you need to die for that belief system. And vice versa, right? And so we can have we can have sharp differences. I think you're dead wrong, and vice versa, and that's the end of it. Whereas,
Kai, you're a salesman. You need to die.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. And that is not, and statistically, most of the world does not view this way. Most of the world views the planet through very religiously charged lenses, in which there are believers and the unbelievers must be brought to heel, they must be converted, enslaved, or executed. That those are the only, that there is no peace. The peace that is spoken of in Islam is the peace of submission. The word Islam itself means to submit. You kneel, you are enslaved, or you die. Those are the only kinds of peace that is acceptable. And those who don't take that view are viewed as weak and not real sincere Muslims, and they too will face the wrath of the more devout. It's like that old rap song. There's no such thing as halfway crooks. There's no such thing, I mean, except from this perspective. It's like there's such thing as halfway.
It's fascinating you bring this up, though. On the point of Muslims, there's a well-known, I guess, the Uyghurs. I don't know if I'm pronouncing it right. The Uyghurs and Muslim minority in China,
right?
And my understanding is that they don't. I mean, there are. You don't. Every couple of months here in Europe, we get some truck of peace. That shit doesn't happen in China.
Nope.
I think for obvious reasons.
Yep. The Chinese are much more ruthless in, it's like, well, we're not going to wipe you out, but we're going to keep an eye on you, and that's how it's going to be. I mean, this level of sort of, I mean, we call it, oh, that's such a terrible double standard. Most of the world has these sort of multiple standards. I remember the first time I visited India, and in the immigration line, I mean, just to apply for a visa to go to India, there was 3 separate categories. There's like Indians that return to India, they get the shortest line. Visitors to India who have no ties to Pakistan, and then there's the Pakistani nationals and those with a Pakistani stamp on their passports. And when I applied for the visa, half the questions that were asked were about, like, do you have any relatives who are Pakistani? Do you have any relatives who are married to Pakistani? Like, they asked the variance of that question for like half. That was all they cared about, was what sort of ties do you have with them? And if you do have ties with them, the government has a right to know every single day where you're staying, who you're hanging out with, and it's just assumed that we can harass you and hound you every single day at our pleasure. We can leave you alone, but we reserve the right to be all of your shit, and that's how it's going to be until you leave. Right, and that's the sort of, the most of the world, they view it from that sort of ruthlessly pragmatic lens, and it's only, and if you think about it, if you are a conquering populace that's looking to subjugate the rest of the world, where would you allocate your resources? Would you go first for the hardened targets, or would you go for the soft targets first? Take their people, take their women, take their wealth, and then use those as forward base of operation, and root out the hardest targets last. And sadly, I think that's what's going on here, is that China is a hard target, and therefore the Islamic world is devoting its primary conquest attentions in the easy soft targets: Western Europe, America, Australia to some extent, Canada. And once they become firmly entrenched as their enclaves, then they can, with the combined resources that they've hijacked and stolen from Western whites, turn it toward their more formidable foes, India and China.
Even so, I would imagine that if push came to shove, China would be very willing to take severe action.
They would.
In a way that the United States or Europe would never do.
That is the thing, is that it's this lack of Christian sort of inhibitions. It's that sort of, the Chinese are willing to do all sorts of horrendous stuff to our own people. And
and this dovetails really well with effectively this, what seems to be an inevitable prisoner's dilemma, and specifically Nash equilibrium between China with its methodology and its history and how it approaches all kinds of things, economics, genetic research, etc., and these very ingrained Western values. And one of the concerns I have, we talked about this a bit privately, is that, and you probably, I think that you took that line from Game of Thrones, which was an excellent point. I think they're in the Eyrie, right? And I forgot his name. I'm a bit tired today. where you have this honorable. So, pardon me.
You don't fight with honor, and he kind of shrugs, looks at the corpse of defeated enemy, goes, "Well, he did."
Right. That decency and honor are great principles if both people are playing the same game. But if your opponent's willing to cheat and do anything and circumvent those principles, then you're just going to end up a sucker in the end, and the worst case scenario, you're going to end up dying. And I fear in general, be it economic practices or, this is the genetic research. In the United States, something I follow a bit, as people on my channel know, I'm interested in genetics, that most of the genetic research and the idea of implementing technology like CRISPR-Cas9, so, fixing problems, diseases, hereditary diseases. Oh, you have a problem in your blood, okay. Let's work towards fixing Alzheimer's. Whereas the Chinese, as I understand, I read up on this, they're actively collecting the genomes of smart people. Yep. And trying to figure out how that all fits, because it sounds like science fiction. It might take them 50 years, but I think they're trying to build super G-loaded, super IQ, super geniuses.
Yep. Yeah. Yep, that's what they want. And it's not like abstract, like Western, like, oh, we're going to publish a white paper and share our knowledge with everybody. No, we're going to figure out what it is. We're going to keep it to ourselves, and we're going to make sure that we can outcompete everybody on the planet. And the other thing is that I touched on this briefly with a conversation with Frame Games. The Chinese also because anything that's new, especially things like genetic engineering, the first few iterations they're going to make mistakes. And if you make mistakes cloning or making smart babies, chances are you're going to have deformed babies, people with horrible diseases. They'll die. The mess will be it would be so horrific that there would be no way a Western medical establishment would ever accept it. The Chinese will do it. They'll make the mistakes. Every single parent of these mistakes will be hushed up with here's some money, shut up and don't say nothing about it. Don't make us look bad. And the Chinese will be happy to have 500,000 deformed babies to have a serum that works 100%, and then that gets rolled out to the rest of the populace, and then we'll just bury all those kids, and then we'll pretend it never happened. We'll just lie straight to your face. Anything in the Western culture that would never stand. You get to 100 deformed babies, and it was because of an experiment. People go to jail for that sort of stuff. They lose their licenses. Entire companies be bankrupted through, and because of this, I think there's just a huge level of moral differential in terms of willingness to visit ugliness upon human subjects in order to get a desirable social outcome. If you can just skip ahead to the end and be like, all right, well, now we wave a magic wand, here's a 100% safe serum that raised the IQ of your baby by 15 points. Of course, who would, and no one would refuse that. But that's not how these things develop. These things develop through trial and error.
Yeah, even the Nazis on occasion produced good research, and then there have been historically, debates whether or not it's ethical. That's a very Western concern, ethical to use the fruits of that research. I imagine the Chinese wouldn't give two fucks. This is useful.
The Chinese would just stolen it, and then they'll just steal it, and they'll be like, oh no, they'll pay lip service to it just because they know it keeps their competitors slow to take up on this. And in the meantime, they'll just kind of laugh privately at those silly round eyes and their morals, and then blast through at full throttle is what's going to happen.
Is that actually an actual term for us, round eyes? Or
that's a term that I've started using. Okay. I doubt it's something that it's a funny term that I've
it's sort of the opposite of slant eyes, basically.
Exactly. Yeah. It's a reverse slur, as it were. And I find it entertaining, and I think other people I've talked to, they've kind of enjoyed me using the term. So it's become sort of I don't know if it's a universal one. But
on the point of theft, this notion of kind of, you could say, innovational theft, the willingness to just, I spy something new here, I'm gonna steal the designs and make use of it. Copyright infringement, as far as I understand, is an alien concept in China, is it not?
Yeah. It's whatever you can. There are entire industries of stealing Western goods, whether it's counterfeiting goods. There is a friend of mine who was he was in an MBA program here in the U.S., and of course, like all highly ranked MBA programs, there was a large contingent of Chinese students there. So they had this whole thing where, hey, come visit China. We can get you, go see like Beijing, whatever. And of course, these students, they said, hey, here's this, he was led to this fascinating underground store in Beijing, where these students took them to. It was like an underground, it was the plain iron door up front, and inside was like effectively a replica of every single high-end luxury. There's like very good fake Hermes bags, Armani, all the major luxury brands in the U.S. was faithfully replicated by forgers and sold for about like a third to half the retail price. And I'm sure the markups of these things are insane. China it's their biggest industry. There's a very casual view toward intellectual property that would shock Westerners if you realize just how bad it was. Every graduate student that comes to America in the hard sciences is, at the very minimum, an asset of the Chinese intelligence industry, if not an out-and-out spy. Everyone is told, keep an eye out. If you're studying mechanical engineering, computer engineering, you may not want to steal USB drives filled with vital data. You may not be comfortable with that, fine. But we will still want you to be our eyes and ears so you can tell our actual agents where the good shit is to steal. And then we'll make our own decision. You're just a boring grad student studying mechanical engineering at Berkeley. But if you know that like floor 7 is where all the good stuff is, we want to know that. Who's doing what kind of research, and then they'll use that information to coordinate with their own spies to do the hardcore intel. Every grad student is basically given a very perfunctory briefing, and then they're also tested for how much are you willing to do for the country. And most people are like, okay, you're just a nerdy guy with a high IQ, and all you want is a master's in engineering. Fine. But even so, keep your eyes open. If you have a predilection to do more, they're definitely very, very welcoming of you to do more for the country. And by more, I mean like stealing American secrets. You see all these stories of the ones who get caught, Chinese nationals who turned out to have been like stealing and duping drives, sending stuff back to Beijing. And these are just stories of people that got caught. Like for every one of those, there's probably 10 or 15 stories that just successfully things were copied. Oh, well, we have no idea. How do the Chinese innovate all this stuff so quickly? We have no idea. They must have really good researchers. Well,
in the short and medium term, this seems to be a strategy that would almost certainly give China a massive leg up against a more principled opponent, the West in general, the United States. But I can't help but wonder, long term, I mean, if one goes far enough back, every society was like that, a society of backstabbers and everyone's in it for himself. Eventually, that creates such disharmony that it becomes unlivable. So I'd imagine that long term, that probably wouldn't be a good idea. But my concern for the West on the macro scale is that it's gonna, if the next 5 decades are going to be that way, and that's the way China's going to operate. Mm-hmm. What can the West do other than to basically sink to the same level and act like a bunch of scumbags, and basically jettison ethical concerns when it comes to research and get rid of ethical conduct in business, etc.?
The third way means taking a race-realistic view of and this is the part that I don't know. It's a persuasion problem. You have to convince Western leaders that an exchange student from Norway is not the same thing as an exchange student from Beijing, right? And that's a hard. And the thing is that the Chinese are savvy enough that they're smart enough at this point. They know that the weakness of Americans is you shriek racism, and then they're very quick to bend over. And, oh no, we're sorry. We'll take that back. To be able to say, yeah, it is racist. So what? If Western whites can get to that point of not letting that be an automatic auto-win cheat code for non-Western whites, then you have a chance. If Because right now it's a cheat code. All you have to do is say that, and you can do the most brazen amount of crime and theft against Western powers, and like, well, we got to treat everyone the same. Everyone isn't the same. Everyone doesn't have the same values, right? A Norwegian PhD student in computer science is not about to steal military secrets and copy paste everything to send back to Norway. That's not happening. Right. Right. We laugh at it sounds preposterous even saying it out loud.
A Viking computer science, right?
Exactly. We're going to plunder your goods and make our Longhorn ships better. No, and to speak honestly about it, I think there's a great simulation which I would encourage. I'll send the link at the end of this conversation of a fun way to illustrate the prisoner's dilemma through a little flash game. It was a Nicholas Case, I think. It was a beautiful illustration of various strategies. Like, you get to play your character, and it's a simple, like, you have two binary decisions. You can either choose to cooperate or defect, and if you cooperate, they defect. Most money for you, but then they get nothing, and vice versa. And then your opponent works off a strategy that you don't know about. So the question is, what do you do? And then what they also did was, because it was a whole little illustration, they had the simulation run various strategies against each other. They have like the naive strategy of you just simply always cooperate no matter what. There is the sneaky strategy of you defect no matter what. There is the tit for tat. There's a bunch of different strategies, and then they actually put them in competition with each other to say who would survive if you create a society of tit for tatters. So that turns out to be, a little bit of a spoiler, is that the tit for tat strategy is in fact an environmentally stable one.
Obviously, it's the basis of functional societies.
Exactly. I think that the U.S., Western powers, has gone too far into the realm of over-trusting, and then other societies seeing this and having more of a propensity for treachery sees its soft mark, where we can either be ripping each other off in our homelands, or we can find this bunch of soft morons who just bend over. And why would you want to compete with other treacherous people for finite resources when you have this very wealthy, kind of dumb, fat nation that's just willing to trust you no matter what?
They're kind of like the dodos who went extinct because they had no natural predators, and they just kind of walked about. And yeah, I imagine I guess as a man of the Middle Kingdom, you could always just say, even if it's not accurate, my ancestors were slaves who built the railroads or something like that.
Right. There's all sorts of cynical ways to play upon white guilt. I mean, there was recently an article it's both irritating, and also I have to admire the resourcefulness of there's some Asian woman that was like, I'm not short, you're just white. No joke. That was an article. White people are too tall, and she's being oppressed because of the fact that I felt like it seemed like an Onion article. Then I dived into no, it's just some Chinese SJW that saw this as her path to power, to hustle Whitey for sympathy gibs. I mean, none of this. These tactics would never work in China, right? The Chinese have subjugated so many ethnicities, erased so many other people. The area as China used to be filled with so many other people, a lot of whom are just permanently erased, and there isn't a contingent of Chinese social justice warriors that are weeping over the crimes that China has committed against the indigenous people of wherever. Nobody cares.
I'm a former linguist, and I have some knowledge. I mean, even the idea as you know, Mandarin is but one of many languages in China, but they're just called dialects. They're actually languages in their own right in many cases. But Cantonese is completely different in most ways, more tones, etc., etc. But these are all just dialects, and that's a political way of sort of top down, saying this is the way it is. We're a unified society, blah de blah. When in reality, even at the linguistic level, it's not the case. But that can be ignored for political considerations. Do you think that? I mean, I bristle at the. I don't think I could ever do it, but I bristle at the idea of engaging in quote unquote identity politics, and yet you got to like Jordan Peterson, he's always about he's very approachable. I call him Purple Pill Peterson in a lot of ways.
Yeah,
and he always goes about individual, and that's what something I feel in my core too. But the problem is, it's obvious throughout society in the United States and in other societies like China, where people are just going to play the identity politics game. And to me, it feels personally filthy and indecent to do so. I don't think I could force myself as an individual to do that. Maybe other people could. But the reality seems to be that if you don't do that,
if you don't do it, you will not survive. This is the hard reality. There's a great quote, a friend of mine put it, is that you may not be interested in identity politics, but identity politics is interested in you.
Yeah.
They will see you as a member of a group, whether you want to or not, and that reticence to put yourself in a group is what will defeat you. That's why I've thrown in with some unlikely allies, is because my identity is, even though genetically Chinese, I feel very little kinship with a lot of the average Chinese behaviors. I am a fan of the West. I am a enthusiastic beneficiary of Western values, and so I have this conflicted love-hate relationship with the white nationalists. It's yes, I want about 80% of what you want, and I'm okay with the fact that you may not like my existence, but I don't think you're going to get 100% what you want anyway, and so I'm happy to throw in with you, understanding that you're gonna the frame games refers to as getting off at the train station at different stops. My view is more of you're gonna get 70-80% what you want at best, and that's pretty much 100% of what I want. So for selfish reasons, I will ally with you, even if I don't agree with you, and even if you find my existence objectionable.
And that's because you personally feel that you're just better off as an individual in a Western American society than in China. Yeah.
Yes, that my idiosyncratic willingness to buck trends, to defy these kinds of rebelliousness would be viewed with tremendous scorn, if not hostility, from law enforcement in China. So to be able to have this, have that sort of room to be disobedient is something I greatly value, and something that I'm only afforded in a place like this.
I know you're limited on time, and there are huge time differences, but a final question to you. As a quote-unquote Chinese American, because I do the hyphenated thing here, I ask a lot of Americans this question because it's sort of this eternal question. What does it mean to be an American to you? I know it's a very cheesy and cliche question.
Don't beat yourself up with it. I think it's an important question. I feel like it's been corrupted, and the definition before was much more. Your view of an American is the Midwestern white guy with his kids. It goes back at least several generations. That's American. And the more recent arrivals, I think there is I definitely disagree with this corrupted SJW view of America as anybody who crosses over and touches the magic dirt of within American territories and shouts base. They view immigration as sort of a kid's game of tag. That if you just touch the right place and shout base, then you're protected. That's not nearly it at all. I think there's a cultural element and a genetic component. So my current view is, ideally, being American, it's an amalgamation of several things. You can be genetically American and culturally kind of very distanced from it. You have the kids that were grown up in America, 5th, 6th generation, and then they join Antifa. They're voting for socialists. They counter-signal everything that's American. Yes, they're Americans of sorts, right? I am enthusiastic about the founding principles of America. I'm genetically not of the founding stock. I see value in a
The Bill
whiter
of Rights,
America.
for example, constitutionality,
Yes,
etc., that sort of thing.
exactly. So I'm in a very weird spot where I'm making some alliances with folks that will have different end results, but at this point we're up against an enemy that is absolutely determined to erase any notion of Americanism. So for me,
Yeah,
it's like
they don't even. I mean, I remember growing up. I think a lot of it was pretense, but nonetheless, I remember growing up with this notion of the Constitution, and particularly the First Amendment, as being this holy, the holiest of the holy,
exactly.
of the Bill of Rights, and they don't. There's not even a pretense with that anymore. It's whatever.
Free speech is now considered hate speech. It's considered very white or whatever. And in some ways, it kind of is. I mean, if you look at the breakdown of, they did like a questionnaire of people from Asian descent, Latino, Black, and white. Things like, what's your attitude towards free speech? Should some speech be banned to protect the feelings of others? Whites are like about 65-70%. It's like, no, if you get your feelings first, whatever. Blacks, other way around. There's about 60-70% are like, yes, you should, laws should be in it. Some speech should be outlawed if it hurts someone's feelings. Who's more American? Right? Someone who can trace their ancestry to being a direct descendant of a slave, they're more quote unquote American by blood and soil, and yet at the same time, in terms of adherence to a founding principle, is absolutely in opposition toward it. If they could get away with it, they would vote for themselves reparations for slavery.
But I think there's a critical issue here, and I recently, and this was a while back, I listened, I don't know if you know him, there's a guy named, I think it's Robert Kagan, he's a...
familiar with one?
Yeah, he's a well-known Jewish liberal who defying being American simply is following the rules and paying your taxes. And he cited this great example. He said, well, I recently encountered a bunch of Guatemalans, and they think America's great because, all they need to do is follow the rules and pay their taxes, and they can exist in their little enclaves, and he didn't say this, and only speak Spanish and not integrate. That's the great thing about America. And he was citing quite literally that as a strength of the United States of living in effectively parallel societies, not integrating. That's this. I mean, well, yeah, I've people on my channel know that I'm a first generation American because my father came from Europe. The reason I left is I can't. There's nothing to connect there with, given that mentality. There's not even an attempt at a kind of unified, and I'm not even talking in terms of I'm not alt-right, but just even a cultural front to try to establish a hegemony of cultural unilateralism or anything like that. It's just it's that vision that liberal leaves. Yeah, it's great because you can be from Mexico or Guatemala and you can live in your own little thing, just pay your taxes and you're all good. Like,
I totally disagree with that. I mean, because part of it is culture. It's not all you are is simply you're kind of you're parasiting off of a host and contributing nothing toward the continuation of what made it what it was. And ultimately, my view, again, I'm more of a genetic determinist, is that you regress toward your means. And if in large enough numbers, that's exactly what happens. You have to make a conscious effort. And I try that as I say this, and I know that there are negative means that I want to be on my guard against regressing toward, and I make a conscious effort toward. And I think that I choose to live in a majority white culture. I think that a lot of the markers here are in fact good and very desirable, and to simply sponge off of the benefits of it and contribute nothing toward it would just be it's just not respectful toward the place that I'm a direct beneficiary of. It's not just a place where you can have, it's just like your country except with lower crime rates and better taxes. That's not what it is. And so to answer your question, I think that my view of American is it's ideas and heritage. And if think about it like if you're applying to grad school if you have like a somewhat weak GPA, you have a much stronger essay or a GMAT score. Likewise, Americanism, my view is it's a point system, right? If you're deficient in one category for whatever reason, you're not of the founding stock, but you're very, very well educated on the Constitution and enthusiasm for the principles that make it what it is, you're in. If you are coming here and flying your own, your origin country's flag, actively shitting on America and inviting more of your countrymen in, then how American are you? This notion that, so-and-so is just as American as you because they have a passport, that binary view is, I completely reject that.
Have you heard of, by the way, apropos, there's a term that you might not, printer nationalism. You can just print the papers and you become,
right.
Yeah.
I've not heard that expression, but yeah, exactly. That I completely and wholeheartedly reject. That's not my view. I think that it's some things are out of your control, like your genetics and whatnot, or where you were born. But the things you do have control over, if somebody has more, and also like if you're born into the country, but you just simply through bad indoctrination because you have whatever, it's like then you've lost a lot of your heritage. You've wasted your birthright through traders associations. Then yes, there's that guy. There's a couple of guys who joined to fight for ISIS. Remember that John, what's his face from Marin?
Yeah.
Right. The jihadi John was caught. Right. How American is that guy? I mean. Well,
that's in a way a symptom of a society. It's kind of lost its fabric. People are lost, and I think this is one of the reasons why you see so many different groups, and even just the sheer weirdness, like furries. I mean, they're people that literally orient themselves in their lives around some non-existent concept, like magic, basically. Furry, being a furry,
and this is why I think that. The existence of people I think this is symptomatic of a secular age. I'm not religious myself, but I think that a lot of meaning comes from a common sort of religious grounding of this. And we all pray to the same God. We take moral direction from a single focus point that encourages and exhorts us toward our higher ideals and discourages us from playing with our most base of vices. And I think a lot of sneering atheists completely poo-poo this notion and think that we can go from a religious age to an enlightened secular age and suffer not at all for it. And we're looking around, and it's like this is not the case.
No, most human beings at least need meaning, and if it's not to be found in a kind of centralized universal message, they will find it in other places.
Other more horrible substitutes like furries, like online discussion forums, or like putting on black masks and beating people up through Antifa. Like there's a lot of opportunistic people that recognize this inherent need for belonging in people, gang leaders and whatnot, that are happy to fulfill a need that in a previous generation would have been fulfilled by the local pastor, by a local organization that's far more pro-social. And so in that regard, I think we're losing something. And that loss makes everyone in America less American, because that's part of it is I think this notion of coming together, that you have a place, a fresh start, an opportunity to build something for yourself. You're not a king. You're not a product of your descendants. There's no hereditary sort of inhibitions to keep you from achieving what you want to achieve. That to me is also part of being American as well. And so, but now all of a sudden, everyone they lean into, well, I'm a blah 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 American. I'm a Mexican American. I'm an undocumented American. Like, how is that even a thing? That just because you crossed a boundary illegally, now all of a sudden you sit. The notion just gets expanded and corrupted to the point where, and of course, at the moment you mention anything like heritage, you're automatically branded a racist. Again, it's the magic word that gets you out of making a rational argument for your side. All you have to do is brand those you disagree with as racist, and now they're forced into either apology mode when what they should say is, you know what, no, or yeah, and so.
Well, I mean,
But
and this is even online because of all these people have branched into groups. And people have labeled me, I think, incorrectly, and they would obviously disagree, a racist, etc. But on the point of meaning, that's something that you could talk about in a mostly neutral tone in the
yes.
mainstream. Why don't I mean I have my ideas why they don't. Why don't mainstream pundits talk about a loss of meaning and how this has sown the seeds of chaos in society? And I'm not saying return to Christianity or anything, but at least talk about an issue that's very pressing, that is a huge contributing factor, and it wouldn't involve things like HBD, or you could just talk about what do we do about that. But they don't even do that. They don't even want to broach that very core
and
concept.
that's why I'm not as big of a fan of Jordan Peterson, but that's why he's getting as much traffic as he is because he can even flirt with such issues. And that has created that there's such a gigantic vacuous hunger that even someone who kind of skirts with these things will be given a disproportionate amount of attention and adulation for it. And it's symptomatic of a secular age, I think. And I'm happy to, we're coming up at the end of our current segment, but I'm happy to expand upon this a little bit further. I mean, Can you tell the audience where you're reachable? I mean, in order to contact Kai, I had to delve into the bowels of Twitter. I'm not going to be making use of that. At Kai Chang at twitter.com. So that's the easiest way to reach me. I also have a podcast of my own that is also linked off of my Twitter bio page. That's the easiest way to find me. It's Kai Chang. I have an over 10-year-old Twitter account. I know. I got on that thing back in 2007. It's 11 years old now. Good Lord.
Well, you're a man of the market. And in case, I will also link Frame Game because Kai Chang partners with him in discussions that have been very interesting, so you might want to check those out.
Fantastic.
And,
yes,
it was an excellent time, and I hope we can have another conversation in the future.
Outstanding. Look forward to it.
If you liked this video, please like, share, and subscribe. And if you enjoy my content, please consider making a donation or becoming a patron. Thanks for watching.